The cannabis industry has seen explosive growth in recent years, with expanded legislative permissions allowing businesses to market to customers unlike in years past. But it's not easy street in the cannabis world. Marketers battle advertising restrictions, a lack of consumer education on the broad spectrum of products, and a need to combat decades of stigmas tying cannabis culture to arguably a single audience profile, the stoner. Hey everyone, it's Noor Nasir, host of AdTech Unfiltered. In this episode, we talk to Sam Hollander. He's the Chief Digital Officer at Enlighten, an advertising and marketing platform that helps cannabis marketers and non-cannabis advertisers navigate the tricky marketing landscape to attract, retain, and market to cannabis audiences. Did I just say cannabis a lot? Let's get into this episode with Sam right now. Sam, I know you recently moved. How's the move going?
Good. My wife and I moved from New York City, where I've been almost my entire life. I grew up in northern New Jersey and then moved into the city and had been there for probably about 12 years. So it's been different, but moving to the suburbs has been nice, quiet and relaxing. And I'm excited for the summer when I can actually go out and enjoy a little bit more of the fresh outdoors and all that type of stuff. Good, but still unpacking and all of that good stuff.
Well, exciting stuff with the move, and then exciting to have this conversation today with you because I will just come out and admit I don't know a ton about the cannabis industry and I don't really know a lot about it from a marketing perspective too. So this is a really good opportunity to educate myself and educate other folks that are curious about this industry that's moving forward very quickly. I think before we jump into a series of questions to lay the groundwork on what's happening in the cannabis industry from a marketing perspective and an advertising perspective, I'd just like to get a quick take on what brought you into the cannabis industry. Why were you energized to move into this career path?
A lot of people have a similar story. And what I mean by that is that the cannabis plant touched them in some kind of unique way, that made them want to get into this industry. For me, it was kind of twofold. My father-in-law unfortunately passed away a few years back of glioblastoma, which is a brain tumor. At that time when he was diagnosed, my wife, as I mentioned, who works in the cannabis industry, she had just gotten into the industry and had done a lot of different research on things that could potentially help him, from pain alleviation to slowing down the growth of the tumor, so on and so forth. She found a unique substance called Rick Simpson oil, also known as RSO, which is a very, very strong compound that you take orally. The doctors actually gave him about 6 months to live, and he ended up living for almost 4 years. He got to see me and my wife get married, as well as do all of the great things that you get to do, go on vacation and all that good stuff. So that was kind of piece one, and then throughout that process, as I mentioned, my wife was in the industry. She was preparing to open a retail store in Somerville, Massachusetts. Her role at that point in time was multifaceted. She was working in a grow in Washington D.C. and learning from the ground up how the industry works, all of the different things that go into growing cannabis, so on and so forth. And then ultimately, kind of took her past experience from the fashion industry with store design and things like that, and she wanted to apply that to cannabis. So she went up to Massachusetts, and I went with her to open a store in Somerville, which is right outside of Boston and Cambridge. She needed to start learning about how she could advertise and market cannabis. Started asking me questions about digital advertising because my background, as you know, Noor, is advertising technology, marketing technology. I knew the obvious. You couldn't advertise on Facebook, you couldn't advertise on Google, but I did not know that a lot of the major outlets for other programmatic opportunities, the publishers, when you go direct to those publishers at that point in time, would not allow cannabis advertising. So I started doing my due diligence. Essentially, came to the conclusion that there was a big void in the market, and that cannabis marketers should be able to advertise, at least programmatically, the way that any other industry should. And if you want a fair comparison, alcohol brands can advertise programmatically. Now, fantasy gaming and gambling companies can advertise programmatically. So why can't cannabis? So after doing my due diligence and working, to identify certain platforms, certain supply platforms, publishers directly that would take cannabis, I started to put together kind of the framework for a business plan, and then was introduced to my two business partners, I would say, are founders of the company that I now work for called Enlighten. After lengthy conversations, they decided to bring me on board to help them continue to build out their in dispensary ecosystem, which I can obviously explain a little bit more as our conversation goes on. But in short, it's basically digital signage, so digital menus, kiosks, and an entertainment platform inside the dispensary. And then additionally, take my vision and fund that and bring it to life. I'm creating a demand side platform that is specific to the cannabis industry.
I definitely want to get back to some of the nuances of what you can offer from an advertising perspective, but we'll take a couple steps back. And
Sure.
just for anyone who's really unacquainted with what is happening in the cannabis industry, you probably might know it better than I do. A lot of people probably know it better than I do. The marketing of yesteryear in the cannabis industry was you knew a guy and somebody else knew that guy, and that's how you were able to have access to product. That's my very kind of unclear understanding of what was going on. And now suddenly people are thrown into this different world where there are new permissions. Legislation has changed, but there's still a lot of permissions that aren't there at this time. Can you give us a little bit of a lay of the land on what has shifted from when we were at one point not able to market or develop product at all, and then just getting us quickly to today? So you can give us the really short version, but what has transpired that's enabled this industry to flourish?
1996 was kind of the pinnacle point. That's when California legalized medicinal cannabis. And since then, it's been, I don't want to say quick, but there's been a drastic transformation of the industry. As of today, there are 37 states that are medicinally or recreationally legal from a consumption perspective and a purchasing perspective. That has obviously drastically changed the industry. And then at a very high level, I think that there's a myriad of different legislation that is pending within our government that will continue to change and shape the industry, as well as certain other major businesses that are continuing to help shape the industry and reduce the stigma as well. So, a few examples. Number one is the Safe Banking Act. The Safe Banking Act essentially just got attached to another bill. It went through the House of Representatives and is now in the Senate. If that bill gets passed, it opens up major financial institutions to the entire industry, which has been an issue prior to this, not just for retailers and distributors, but also for marketers. So that will create a much safer environment. Additionally, there are two other legalization bills that are being considered. One is the Chuck Schumer bill, which most people, I'm sure, are aware of. And that's a Democratically led bill. And then there's I believe her name is Nancy Mace, and she is a Republican. So there's now a Republican led bill as well. The Republican led bill is actually being pushed, and there's some funding that's by Amazon, which is pretty huge. Personally, I don't think either of those bills are going to pass in the shape that they're currently in, but it starts the conversation, especially from a government perspective, and how that should be shaped. Other examples, the major sports leagues. I think that's big. If you look back over the last kind of 3 to 4 years, all of the major sports leagues have either taken cannabis off of their controlled substances list that players can consume. And then additionally, in the last week, the NFL actually is funding $1 million research project on cannabis and pain reduction in place of opioids, which in my mind is also huge because if you look at the NFL, it's probably the largest marketing machine in our country, as well as one of the largest organizations in our country that arguably may have more influence than the government. By the NFL acknowledging that I think it says a lot to the public about where the industry is and where the industry is going. Additionally, there are now a lot of shifts that are going on from an advertising and marketing perspective, and tools and resources that are finally starting to come into the industry that were not previously available. Things like programmatic advertising, more measurement and attribution, so on and so forth.
I want to get into that advertising piece, specifically programmatic, but I'll first ask you this question. If I'm out there, I have a cannabis product or series of products and I'm looking to market them, what's kind of the first step I need to take to start getting myself in the right headspace? What does any brand marketer need to be thinking about first before they launch a campaign?
Yeah, from a branding perspective, the world that we live in today has made it difficult for marketers. And what I mean by that is everything is such a fast transaction that people just want results like that. That leads to taking the wrong steps when it comes to developing a marketing plan specific in cannabis. I constantly hear from marketers, and my team at Enlighten constantly hears from marketers, this is great. I can use programmatic advertising to target the right audience, but on day two, I want a return on my ad spend. And it just doesn't work like that. If you are a new brand entering a market, entering the market, as an example, maybe it's a saturated market like California, maybe it's a newer market like Massachusetts or some of the emerging markets on the East Coast. You need to start with brand building. You need to put in the time and the research to identify who your audience is and who you're talking to. There are several different ways to go about that. There's the traditional mechanisms of talking to your current and existing clients when they're in the store or they're checking out online, all of that different type of stuff. And then there's also using other data providers, geolocation tools, visitation tools, historical purchase analysis, things of that nature to better understand where your product niche is and who that audience is that you're targeting. Once you've done that, it's formulating your messaging around that so that you can better target those individuals. And I want to be clear, even if you have done all of that research and exercise and all of those exercises, that doesn't mean that you're going to get a return on your ad spend right away. You still need to go out and practice brand building or brand awareness, as we might call it in the industry. And when I say the industry, I mean ad tech as a whole. You need to spend months, if not years, putting your brand name out there and constantly hitting that core audience so that it resonates with them. There's the rule of seven that we all know about in ad tech and the advertising industry, and that's hitting a consumer at least a minimum of 7 times before that message even begins to resonate with them. I would argue in today's day and fashion, when there is so much saturation from brands with Instagram and TikTok and billboards and everything that you're doing with all this digital technology, that it might even need to be more than that. That means that you need to be doing some kind of brand awareness and constantly hitting that core consumer every day, and then not even trying to hit that core consumer as they start to engage with your ad. And then ultimately you drive them down the funnel through remarketing tactics, crafting your messaging to target them with the right call to action, all of that type of stuff. It's understanding how that audience is evolving and the other pieces that make up that archetype of who that consumer is, so that your audience strategy is always evolving, so that you're continuing to not just target who your core consumer is and remarketing to that consumer to make sure that they become a loyalist, but you're also driving new consumer adoption.
Yeah, I appreciate the points about something that's seemingly so obvious as far as like taking it back to the basics and doing that pre-planning and research on who your customer is. I imagine, and I didn't do deeper research on this, but there are many probably first-time entrepreneurs who clearly haven't sold anything before in the cannabis industry, and they might be taking insight from the fact that they maybe built businesses in other industries where there are pre-existing audiences, where they know how to market to those consumers, and now you've shifted it into an industry where a lot of that information isn't just publicly available. So there's more work that goes into understanding what and who your customer is before you start launching a campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're not researching who that audience is, if you're not diving into the data and you don't have a data strategy to better segment those different audiences, because it's not going to just be one audience, it's always going to be multiple different audiences. And keeping that high level, it may be your core consumer, may be a millennial, but I guarantee that you're probably also touching some form of Gen Z, Gen X, and maybe even a boomer audience. So that strategy needs to always be evolving. And if you look at the data, it will always lead you in a direction to better understand that. So having that strategy in place and working with various different partners, companies like us at Enlighten, companies like the company that you work for, do a great job at that and have partners that can help with that also and guide potential partners in the right direction to formulate that strategy and get the right tools and resources in place to be able to better understand that data so that you can make the most informed decisions possible.
You just mentioned, Sam, that any marketer in the cannabis industry is probably not going to have a single consumer or consumer profile that they're going after or a single audience. But I think for maybe a less well informed outsider, the presumption is, well, you're going after people who are interested in cannabis based products. So I guess the audience is stoners, and however you can target those guys or gals. What do you say to that? What are the other consumer profiles? Are there key consumer profiles that need to be regularly considered? Because now, as the product opens up, we'll maybe be dispelling some of these myths around who it is that exactly takes advantage of some of these
Yeah.
different products.
Completely false misconception that people who smoke cannabis are these lazy stoners who sit on the couch and eat donuts and Cheetos. It's actually really not true. In fact, in August of 21, there was a study that was done by an e-commerce company in the cannabis space called Dutchy that shows that the majority of cannabis consumers are actually very successful, motivated, and health conscious adults. I think a great example, there was another article that came out, I think it was Insider, also last year. It was about a group of Peloton super fans who like to smoke cannabis before they cycle. It's not just that stigma that has been associated with the industry for such a long time. There's a myriad of different audience segments that are starting to come to the forefront in the industry, if you will. In terms of sales, Gen Z saw the largest growth segment last year, 127% in terms of sales. Millennials grew 46% and Gen X grew 29%. Another study has shown that about 50% of the people in the study that were baby boomers are open to consuming cannabis for medicinal purposes. And then additionally, women are becoming increasingly interested in consuming cannabis. In fact, about 35% of cannabis consumers are now female. There's obviously other sub archetypes within that, and you can layer on third party data and all of that type of stuff. And the way that marketers should be thinking about it, at least this is what I talk to a lot of our clients about, you should be thinking of cannabis as just a piece of the entire makeup of who your consumer is.
You mentioned that there are a lot of, and maybe the majority of people who are existing cannabis consumers. They're productive, contributing members of society. That was one thing. And then another thing you mentioned is that there are statistics that are suggesting that there are a lot of people today who don't consume, but who are interested in consuming, that could be a part of some audiences that marketers would want to target. So that takes us back to a point that we just lightly mentioned earlier on, which is consumer education. How important is educating consumers or potential consumers through advertising? Because that might be the opening through which they're learning about what is all out there.
Education is a major, major piece for cannabis advertisers. It aids in providing a platform for potential consumers to learn about the benefits of the cannabis plant and what that looks like. There's a myriad of different ways to do that. You mentioned advertising and taking more of that PSA approach, if you will. From a brand building perspective, I actually think that that's very important. Most consumers, whether they consume cannabis or they don't even know the difference between an indica and a sativa or what a terpene is. Fun fact, a terpene is basically the flavor that you get when you're consuming a product. But leveraging those PSAs and really being able to educate consumers with, why they should be thinking about consuming cannabis, what the benefits are, so on and so forth, are important. Now, there's going to be brands out there that are targeting more of that audience who just wants to get high. And from that perspective, that's perfectly fine. And that messaging probably doesn't need to have an educational approach. But if you're more of a high end brand that's trying to scale and grow that reputation of kind of being in the lux category, if you will, you definitely need to take that approach, because that consumer is most likely a fairly sophisticated consumer who wants to know what they're putting in their body. Additionally, even cannabis consumers, as I mentioned before, they don't really know the difference. So you still need to educate them when they're in the dispensary and as they're moving throughout that discovery and shopping experience. A great example of that is walking into the dispensary environment. Most dispensaries now are fairly upscale retail environments that are built out with digital signage, kiosks, digital menus, entertainment platforms, so on and so forth. Those are all excellent opportunities for brands and retailers to use those from a branding perspective, a messaging perspective, and in Enlighten's case, an advertising perspective, because we have an ad platform inside of the dispensary to educate consumers with messaging. Whether that messaging is either right in front of your face on one of those screens in the dispensary or on a kiosk, as an example, where you can drive engagement and search and learn about different products. Oh, and bonus to that, that's a great opportunity for a retailer slash brand to actually capture some consumer information. And by capturing that consumer information, bam, all of a sudden you have somebody that you can turn into a loyalist. Oh, and also, as most marketers know right now, we're dealing with the elimination of the IDFA and the ADID and the cookie apocalypse. First party data is becoming more and more important. So through that education opportunity and consumer capture, you also have first party data.
Obviously, a lot of what you just described suggests that there's a lot of room for growth and opportunity and bright eyed people who are going to be learning about new products that they can take advantage of. On the flip side, we touched on it lightly earlier, that there are some struggles that are unique to this industry that separate it from other industries where you can advertise with more ease. So, Sam, can you tell us a little bit about some of those challenges that the cannabis marketer is challenged by when trying to advertise?
Yeah, I think there's a number of different challenges. Fragmentation when it comes to measurement and attribution is huge, and probably the number one thing that most MarTech and ad tech platforms are trying to solve for. Yes, you can leverage geolocation data to provide foot traffic analysis and all of the back end tools and resources that you can use to kind of touch the various different platforms to tie that to a retail visit. Yes, you can track online sales via standard universal pixels and other mechanisms, but ultimately there is not a unified ecosystem or approach that provides more of that one-to-one solution for cannabis brands and advertisers. That's something that I know we're working on in the background a lot. Another major issue, or major hurdle, I should say, is the regulations. A lot of marketers in this industry hear the word digital advertising and they automatically go to Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, all the big social platforms, which we all know, as I mentioned earlier, will not take cannabis dollars. So as a result, they automatically assume I can't advertise digitally. That's actually not the case. There are now numerous different outlets that you can go to advertise programmatically, like Enlighten. Additionally, there are publishers, premium publishers like Rolling Stone, that will take cannabis dollars directly on their platform. And that gives you an opportunity to go about it that way as well. There are numerous different outlets that you can use to advertise now. And really, at the end of the day, what it comes down to is just making sure that you're abiding by the state regulations. Every state, because cannabis is not federally legal, has a different set of regulations about what you can and can't do from an advertising and marketing perspective within the confines of that state. As long as you're working with a partner that has a reputation in cannabis, you should not run into that issue, because they should be able to understand those regulations and be paying attention to how those regulations are evolving on a weekly basis to be able to compliantly serve ads within any given state, DMA, or hyperlocal campaign.
Yeah, many people in the cannabis industry probably already understand this, but just for those who are less knowledgeable about it, I think what separates the challenge of a cannabis marketer from any other type of marketer is that you can't just set up a campaign and drive people from all across the United States to a website to buy product like you can in many other industries, and that's seemingly abnormal for many marketers who are very accustomed to that not being a hurdle that they're going to face. And so the legislative piece is just such a massive hurdle that needs to be constantly considered depending upon where they're looking to pick up customers and new accounts.
Yeah, there is direct to consumer exists, but on a very small scale and only in select states in the US. There is no interstate commerce. What that means is if you have a license in a certain state, you can only operate in that state. Now, let me clarify, there are companies called multi state operators. A multi state operator is essentially the largest of the large big cannabis companies. Curaleaf, Canopy, Holistic Industries, PharmaCann, so on and so forth. Those companies are companies that have individual licenses to operate vertically within that state. And vertically means that they can distribute, in some states have their own brands, as well as sell in a retail environment. It is technically illegal to cross state lines, both from a consumer perspective and from a business perspective. So, as a result, to your point, you have to operate within the confines of that state. So, if you are advertising with a multi state operator, a lot of times you have to look at multiple sets of creative and multiple different rules and regulations and almost operate as if you're setting up 3, 4, 5, 10 separate advertising campaigns because of the various different state regulations. What we tend to recommend at Enlighten is working with us to look at the state regulations and picking the strictest of the state regulations. That way, you can kind of have one set of creative, or maybe two or three that you want to A/B test across that entire market. That's one way to get around it. But to your point, Nora, it's very, very strict. That's why I recommend to anybody who does want to test the waters with this industry, whether you're an endemic brand looking to get into programmatic advertising or a non-endemic brand looking to tap into the largest growing audience segment in the US. It's working with partners and organizations that have experience in this industry from an ad tech perspective, because we're going to understand the nuance of all those rules and regulations and how to actually activate something versus platforms that are frankly just trying to dabble in the space because they see a revenue opportunity.
Sam, let's get into an example of if I'm a cannabis marketer and I'm trying to build my first ad tech campaign. How might I want to partner with you? What kind of questions are you going to ask of me? How do I get started?
So we have a team of specialists that will work with you to understand your brand, who you're trying to target. As I mentioned earlier, we provide a myriad of business intelligence solutions that allow you to better understand the various different audience trends, whether that's historical visitation patterns, the origins of where they live, behavioral tied to demographic and psychographic information, looking at historical purchase data. Enlighten is unique because we sit in the intersection of marketing and advertising and retail. The company actually started 5, 6 years ago as a retail signage company, powering a lot of that digital environment in the dispensary that we were talking about earlier, digital menus, interactive kiosks, the content management platform to entertain and educate consumers in the dispensary. And that ultimately evolved into an advertising platform, both in the dispensary and out of the dispensary. Given that unique position of where we sit, we actually work with a number of different partners to have access to actual verified purchase data tied to the cannabis consumer. So we can look at that and analyze that and understand various different trends, getting that down to the actual products that people are purchasing and creating various different audience archetypes and things like that. So, that's kind of the first step. We want to work with you to outline who that is. Once we do that, we'll put a proposal in front of you in terms of what that's going to look like, how we're going to activate that campaign using a myriad of different solutions, geolocation, contextual, keyword, our in-dispensary environment. If you're a brand, if you are a retailer, you can't advertise in the dispensary, unfortunately, because it's considered competitive. And then essentially taking that and using that and activating that within the DSP, and then really taking a day by day and a week by week approach so that we can look at what's working, what's not working, and ultimately optimize so that as we get towards the middle of a campaign and the end of a campaign, delivering on the results that any advertiser is looking for, whether that's foot traffic, sales, brand awareness, so on and so forth. And I think one of the things that we're doing differently that has really been a pain point for the industry is transparency. And you're probably going to laugh, or most of your listeners will laugh when they hear this, because transparency was a hot button topic in ad tech 3, 4 years ago. And especially in the early days of programmatic, when there were only a handful of platforms and a lot of buyers were getting smoke and mirrors and all of that different type of stuff, carpet bombing, all of that. A few years ago, the cannabis industry was very much the same. And at Enlighten, it was our mission to really fix that. And we saw no reason why our partners shouldn't have complete transparency into the whole buying process. And what that means is we will provide you a full weekly report of what's working, what's not working, all the way down to the domain level, the device level, the tactic level, so that you can actually look at that data, not just from an enlightened perspective and how we're going to use that to improve our campaigns, but also from a holistic marketing perspective, no pun intended on the holistic. Because a lot of that data and information, looking at the various domains, may tell you, okay, you're hitting a certain audience. Maybe it's a music fan and you want to go and buy some inventory on Rolling Stone, or maybe it's a sports fan and you want to go and buy inventory on Sports Illustrated. Maybe there's certain trends from a foot traffic perspective and an engagement perspective that are telling you there's local publications that you may want to look at, or your consumers are coming from a specific location or DMA, so you might want to put a billboard in that area. So we're working a lot with our partners to do all of that different type of stuff, in the hopes that our clients are going to look at us more as a partner versus someone who's just selling them advertising.
I think a final question to tie back to something that you mentioned earlier on, maybe one of the first things you mentioned, folks oftentimes will think it's the massive social media platforms that I need to be running across. I can't run across them today. So it's a challenge for companies like Enlighten and others in the cannabis space that want to provide a platform for advertising and marketing to help dispel those myths. Do you think that there's going to be a shift at some point where these major platforms are going to make it accessible? Because I feel like that's inevitable, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's inevitable. Not only is it a huge revenue opportunity, I think in the beginning of the call you mentioned the growth of the industry. It's $1 billion industry now, and $1 billion industry equates to a lot of marketing dollars. So I do think that it will ultimately happen. It's just a matter of when. Is that after safe banking is passed, or some form of safe banking is passed? Because Now all the major financial institutions are involved. That probably signals that the federal government isn't going to come after advertising platform, although with all the privacy stuff, Facebook could be a target. So, now Meta could be a target. So I don't want to speak for them. I could see them waiting until federal legalization happened just to be safe. I do think that safe banking changes the trajectory for a lot of companies from a social perspective and a search perspective, meaning Facebook, now Meta, Instagram, obviously the same company, Google, Twitter, etc. Given everything that's going on in the microscope that they're under, I wouldn't be surprised if that didn't happen until federal legalization takes place in some way, shape, or form. Or the government comes out and basically says, yeah, even though we're going after you for all this privacy stuff, we're not going to stop you from going after, cannabis dollars, if you will.
So it's not going to happen tomorrow, is what I'm taking away from this call, but it will happen at some point. And in the meantime, there are opportunities to advertise that marketers can take advantage of and may need to spend some time getting educated around. But there are folks like you, there are platforms like the offerings that you have enlightened that people can take advantage of. So anything else you want to share, anything you're excited about for 2022 around the cannabis space and that you want to get cannabis marketers excited about too?
The industry is evolving, which I think is very exciting. I also think that more and more brands, and that includes retailers, are starting to understand the value of multi-channel advertising. That's going to be very exciting to see the shift and evolution of what that becomes. Additionally, there's a lot of exciting things happening from a legalization perspective in emerging markets, specifically New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. When the first stores do open in 2023, and the plants, no pun intended, will be seeded in 2022. And that's when brands operators will start thinking about branding and advertising. But I also think that given the legalization and the ties to the advertising industry, that there's going to be a huge branding shift in terms of creativity, resources, solutions, so on and so forth, that are going to really start to come to market as we get to the tail end of this year and move into 2023, which I'm really excited for. Those markets also just create a huge opportunity for marketers, both in the industry because of scale and the size of the metro area, and then additionally for non-endemic brands that are interested in activating a subsegment of who a cannabis audience is, because those consumers then get put into that data pool of a cannabis consumer, right? So that scale just becomes bigger in terms of reaching that core audience, and we get to be able to understand them better. So those are some things that I'm excited for. One other thing that I think is really cool that we started to develop in conjunction with a unique partner is basically taking that social environment that you can get on Instagram, on an Instagram story, and we're actually taking that and creating a solution that allows you to activate on that in a programmatic environment. So the idea is basically your standard display ad becomes an Instagram story essentially. And I know marketers will probably get upset with me calling it an Instagram story because you're buying an audience and that audience is on Instagram. So let's call it a creative unit that basically mimics that experience where you're still buying that audience. It's just not in Instagram, right? It's, a cannabis audience that's going to Rolling Stone or Variety or Barstool, TMZ, so on and so forth. So I think that's cool. And that just speaks to the evolution and innovation that entrepreneurs are thinking about in this industry and how they can kind of overcome some of the rules, regulations, and lack of platforms to do the things that they might do in a traditional marketing environment.
A lot of innovation on the cusp of coming to fruition and a lot of stuff already in the hopper that you've just described. So I really appreciate you giving us this download on what's happening out there, what you are doing at Enlighten to help cannabis marketers, and just give us some of that baseline breakdown as well. Good luck with setting up the new house, Sam.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. Nora, it was a pleasure to be here.
Thanks to Sam Hollander, Chief Digital Officer at Enlighten, for breaking down challenges facing cannabis marketers, how advertisers can combat those issues programmatically, and what to look forward to in the year ahead. Even if you're not in the cannabis space, nor planning to market to cannabis consumers, the complexities facing this industry are a good case study for how to problem solve as an advertiser, and I hope this episode offered both some inspiration and information. That's it for this episode. I'm Noor Nasir. More AdTech Unfiltered coming up real soon.